People frequently find it difficult to understand why Europe has maintained an interest in Africa. Even though European nations like France still take advantage of Africa, there is one area where Europe is open to change: natural gas. It's interesting to note that European nations rely significantly on energy imports, and historically, Russia provided them with oil and natural gas. However, Europe's energy security has been jeopardized with the construction of Nord Stream 1 and 2. Therefore, in an attempt to abandon its exploitative inclinations, Europe looks to Africa, which has vast natural gas reserves that might sustain several nations for years. In order to secure natural gas, this forces Europe to approach Africa and take a more egalitarian stance. However, how can Europe's energy crisis be resolved by a gas pipeline project? What benefits does it offer Africa that make it the center of attention? It's pretty obvious why Africa is essential to Europe's energy supply. Large deposits of oil, natural gas, and other resources are found throughout Africa. But in Europe's interests, natural gas is paramount. The Petroleum Minister's spokesperson, Horatius Egwa, affirms that Nigeria has Africa's largest natural gas reserves. Nigeria barely supplies 14% of the European Union's ship-delivered LNG imports, despite this distinction. This suggests the possibility of higher revenue generation and more gas exports. The 27-member EU is aggressively looking for alternate sources of natural gas as Europe struggles with decreased supplies from Moscow, which is driving up energy prices and raising fears of a recession. European leaders hold talks with nations like Qatar, Norway, and most crucially, North Africa. Algeria is important because of its pipelines to Spain and Italy. Egypt has negotiated agreements with the EU and Israel to increase LNG supplies, while Italy just concluded a $4 billion gas deal with Algeria. Angola and Italy also inked a gas agreement. Despite international pressure to move away from fossil fuels, African leaders, such as President Ouattara of Ivory Coast, are excited for their nations to gain from such initiatives. Acknowledging that millions of Africans lack access to electricity, they also seek to ensure that not all resources are exported. But today, more than ever, Europe is keen to purchase natural gas from Africa. European nations seem to be competing for natural gas in Africa in a way that is similar to their previous colonization attempts. Let's examine the importance and specifics of the Niger and Trans-African Pipeline, also referred to as the Trans-Saharan Gas Pipeline. By linking Nigeria, Niger, and Algeria, this proposed natural gas pipeline would give the EU access to a variety of gas supply sources. Remarkably, the original plan for this pipeline project dates back to the 1970s, and Europe had its sights set on it as early as 50 years ago. To begin project preparations, the Algerian national oil and gas company Sonatrach and the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation signed a memorandum of understanding on January 14, 2002. Penspen Limited was hired by the NNPC and Sonatrach in June 2005 to carry out a feasibility study, which was completed in September 2006 and verified the pipeline's operational, financial, and technical viability. On February 20, 2009, NNPC and Sonatrach decided to proceed with the development of a joint venture agreement and a memorandum of understanding including the three governments. On July 3, 2009, in Abuja, the energy ministers of Nigeria, Niger, and Algeria formally signed the intergovernmental agreement on the project. The Trans-Saharan Gas Pipeline project took a step forward on July 28, 2022, when the energy ministers of Algeria, Niger, and Nigeria signed a memorandum of agreement to turn it from a planned concept to a workable project. The third tripartite ministerial meeting in Algiers ended successfully with this agreement, which was co-signed by Nigerian Minister of Energy and Renewable Energy Mahamane Sani Mahamadou, Nigerian Minister of State for Petroleum Resources Timipre Sylva, and Algerian Minister of Energy and Mines Mohamed Arkab. Let's now examine the pipeline's course in more detail. The pipeline is expected to start in Nigeria's Warri region and go north through the country until it reaches Hassi R'Mel in Algeria. It will link to existing pipelines in Hassi R'Mel, including the Medgaz, Galsi, Maghreb-Europe, and Trans-Mediterranean pipelines. From the gas transmission hubs at El Kala and Beni Saf on Algeria's Mediterranean coast, These pipelines deliver gas to Europe. The pipeline is expected to be 4,128 kilometers long, with 2,310 kilometers in Algeria, 841 kilometers in Niger, and 137 kilometers in Nigeria. With diameters ranging from 48 to 56 inches, its capacity is anticipated to support up to 30 billion cubic meters of natural gas per year. The pipeline was initially expected to require an initial investment of about $10 billion, with an extra $3 billion set aside for gas gathering centers, and it was originally planned to be operational by 2015. Regarding ownership, the pipeline will be built and operated by a partnership made up of the Republic of Niger, Sonatrach, and the NNPC. At first, Sonatrach and the NNPC will jointly own 90% of the company, with Niger keeping the remaining 10%. Nigeria and the Russian energy behemoth Gazprom have been in talks about possible participation in the project. Royal Dutch Shell, France's Total SA, Italy's Eni SPI, and India's GAIL are among the other interested parties. Partners need to provide more than simply financial help, the Algerian energy minister stressed. The energy ministers of Nigeria and Algeria have both stated that they are amenable to outside cooperation, but they emphasize the significance of significant advantages. Let's now examine the possible advantages for the participating African nations. First and foremost, it's critical to remember that the pipeline is presently being built and could take several years to finish. Africa may gain from this since it gives time to think through the terms of the pipeline and guarantee that African nations receive more advantages. Countries in Africa now have the chance to put their own interests ahead of those of Europe as the continent's dynamics change. Up to 30 billion cubic meters of gas per year might be transported from Nigeria via the $13 billion pipeline once it is up and running. The pipeline would then proceed north through Niger and Algeria. The TSGP gas will then either be loaded onto liquefied natural gas carriers for export or transferred to Europe via the Trans-Mediterranean pipeline, which runs beneath the ocean. The three African nations would receive billions of dollars in revenue as a result. To put it in context, Africa might make an average of $147 billion a year if Europe is able to replace Russian gas through the Trans-Saharan Gas Pipeline. This sum is equivalent to what the EU paid Russia for its energy imports in 2021. It's crucial to remember that we are only looking at one pipeline with sellers in three African nations. Due to strong demand, natural gas reserves from other African nations that join the pipeline are anticipated to be absorbed by European markets. Energy analysts are still pessimistic about African gas entering Europe anytime soon, though. According to others, the pipeline might not be built in the upcoming 10 years. According to Isaac Body, a Nigerian public finance expert from Abuja, the project's biggest obstacle may be the absence of political will. However, historically, whenever the governments of the member nations changed, the pipeline regained speed. In 2022, representatives from Algeria, Niger, and Nigeria convened in Niamey, Niger, to rekindle interest in the Trans-Saharan Gas Pipeline. The three countries' energy ministers then agreed to create a task force for the project in July and signed a memorandum of understanding to update an existing feasibility study. Algeria, Niger, and Nigeria have resurrected a multi-billion-dollar gas project that has been dormant for decades as part of Europe's efforts to lessen its need on Russian natural gas. Nigeria's Petroleum Minister Timipre Sylva revealed that European companies and countries will provide the project's cash, and talks are already under progress. The three African countries formed a joint committee to research the viability of building a 4,128-kilometer gas pipeline that would connect southern Nigeria, Niger, and Algeria. The African Energy Chamber, a group that promotes collaboration in the continent's energy industry, has praised the project's resuscitation. The Trans-Saharan Gas Project pipeline was conceived with the intention of enhancing natural gas transportation in Africa. Several African governments are taking steps to guarantee the smooth distribution of these resources throughout the continent, which will promote regional economic growth, given Africa's substantial contribution to the production of crude oil, liquefied natural gas, and other petroleum products. Notably, both regional and international oil and gas businesses are showing an increasing interest in investing in Africa's oil and gas endeavors, including BP, Total from France, Eni from Italy, and Baker Hughes. The TSGP's operationalization gives the African nations involved in the initiative a great deal of influence. These countries can strategically use the pipeline as a negotiating weapon to set gas prices and negotiate trade deals because they supply gas to Europe. African nations may be able to establish themselves in the global energy market with this newfound leverage, leading to improved economic outcomes through advantageous trade conditions. In contrast to the conventional story of European control over Africa, the reversal of power dynamics enables African states to articulate their interests and bargain more fairly. Now, European leaders are traveling to Africa because they want Africa's gas and are willing to negotiate as often as Africa wants. The idea that European leaders are taking the initiative while African leaders are being called upon is called into question because Africa has the negotiating power in this situation. For many years, Europe's major priority when interacting with Africa has been energy. It has, nevertheless, recently taken center stage. European leaders who are keen to identify alternatives to Russian natural gas are often seen congregating in African capitals. Despite the need to switch to renewable energy, this greater participation has given African peers hope that the conflict in Ukraine will alter the dynamics of the continent's connection with Europe and possibly attract a new wave of gas investments. In order to seek gas accords, the president of Poland traveled to Sahel in September, while German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also sought agreements in this field in May. In order to solve Europe's energy issue while upholding pledges to cut greenhouse gas emissions, Scholz recently underlined the significance of working with nations where new gas reserves have the potential to be developed. African capitalists are hopeful that the demand from Europe would result in the funding of gas infrastructure for both domestic and export use. In any case, Europe needs to finance the pipeline and make sure all obstacles are removed because it is essential for the continent, whose nations are always in dire need of energy. Because African nations would have the authority to choose gas pricing and negotiate all arrangements, Africa will be able to benefit from the pipeline permanently. Even more regional collaboration and integration among African countries can be fostered by the TSGP. Coordination between nations would be necessary for cooperation on such a significant infrastructure project, which might result in closer alliances and diplomatic connections throughout Africa. By working together, African nations would be able to advance together. In addition to supporting pipeline operations, the pipeline's construction would spur the growth of related infrastructure, including roads, railroads, and telecommunications networks, which would facilitate the transportation of natural gas and promote regional connection and development. The TSGP might help African nations reduce their environmental effects, switch to greener energy sources, and support international efforts to tackle climate change. The demand for natural gas in Africa is expected to rise annually, making the continent a vital resource on which Europe will rely.